Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So as my accent may give away, I don't speak any Polish, so this is the extent of what I got. I can copy and paste, but pronunciation is no good. So again, my name is Amanda Stockwell, and I am here to talk about the Build, Measure, Learn loop and how the way that most people do it is broken. So just out of curiosity, to how many people does this look familiar? Okay, good. How many of you would consider yourselves like a designer or a UX person of some sort? Okay, not that many. How many people are developers? A few more. How about product managers? Couple? Okay, all right, great. How about something else completely that I didn't mention? Wow, okay, good. Well, so just to make sure that we are all kind of starting from the same place, I'm going to kind of revisit the lean startup. So what is the lean startup again? The lean startup is really just an approach to building a new business. And it's really a repackaging of existing models about the scientific method, but it's really centered around reducing risk when you're building a new business. So for those of you who are familiar with waterfall, traditionally you get this great big burst of work, you do a whole bunch of design work, and then you build a whole bunch of stuff at a time, and that's kind of the traditional way. So it kind of looks like this. I build everything, all the things. And it's going to be so magical, and you spend months or years or God knows how long building it, and you're all excited, you put it out, and nobody cares. It's so frustrating, right? So the whole point of the lean startup, there's a whole bunch of core concepts, but the whole point of the lean startup is that this doesn't happen. So there's a bunch of kind of key things that you look at. One of them is that entrepreneurship is everywhere, which means that anybody can have good ideas and be the source of that good inspiration. A huge component of it is to eliminate waste, which is the whole kind of lean methodology. That actually comes from manufacturing, but we won't talk too much about that today. There's innovation accounting and validated learning, which essentially means that you have to measure stuff, and it has to actually be relevant to your business. And then finally, this build, measure, learn loop. But basically, all of that is saying that you take the scientific method. This is, if you can't quite see, it's how much turmoil does the science project cause families? I don't know if this is as true here as in the States, but it almost always sucks to help your kids with a science project. But here are the basic steps of the scientific method, right? You observe something happening. You ask some sort of question about it, you make a hypothesis, you do an experiment, and then you come to your conclusion. These are the basic steps of the scientific method, and also the basic steps of the lean startup. And this build, measure, learn soup is really centered on this bottom part, the build, measure, learn, experiment and conclusion kind of piece of it. So let's dig into that a little bit more. So essentially, the build, measure, learn loop is that you build something called an MVP, also known as a minimally viable product. That term gets confused a lot, and we'll talk about that in a second. Then you measure some sort of meaningful data. Again, to Jamie's earlier point, she queued this up quite nicely. Thank you, Jamie. That you want to measure something meaningful, and then you learn to pivot or persevere, meaning either you keep going the way you thought you should, or you make a decision to make some sort of change. So let's talk about build first. You want to build a minimum viable product that is required to learn. However, required to learn can take on a lot of different looks. I'm not sure if you're familiar. This is Kevin Durant in the United States. Basketball is very popular. And last year he won the MVP award, and he cried and said that the real MVP was his mom. And in this case, a real MVP is not half-baked. It's not a bad experience. But it's also not necessarily code. And a lot of times what we hear, especially in sort of the agile and lean world, is that you have to have something working, right? Working software, working code. And while that's awesome, it's not actually an MVP, because that doesn't necessarily mean you're able to test your real experiment. So because it's almost lunchtime, let's take an example with desserts. So a good MVP for dessert, a snack, might be a chocolate cupcake. It's delicious, it's pretty good. It's a good first round. But maybe you put out a bunch of cupcakes and you realize that no one really likes the chocolate ones that much. Instead, you want vanilla. You want to add some sprinkles. So you make a little bit of a change, but you're still doing basically just one thing at a time. It's a small piece. And so that's a good iteration. Another good iteration might be this, right? This looks even better. I think this one's homemade. There's sprinkles inside the cupcake, and the frosting, I think, is buttercream. That looks much more appealing to me than the first round. Here's what is not an MVP. This is not minimum. If you've ever tried to make one of these cakes, tell me how, because I tried, and it turned out not very good. Another thing that is not an MVP is the individual components that make up an experience, right? So again, sort of that experience of building just a piece of architecture or just a small piece of something. I can't eat back-end architecture or framework for a snack, right? That's not delicious. Just like I probably shouldn't drink oil or eat a raw egg. You want to have a complete experience. But also, it can't be a mess. This is not viable. That's actually kind of what it looks like when I tried to make that fancy cake. So essentially, when you build an MVP, what you want to build is a small slice of something that can get to the root of what you're trying to learn. We'll talk a little bit more about that. All right, so that's the build part of the build, measure, learn loop. Then we get to the measure part. So here's, and again, teed up nicely by Jamie, here's the problem. You can measure just about anything. And it could be that you measure how awesome you think your own stuff is. And that's great, but not exactly that helpful if you're trying to make a decision about where your business should go. So there's this concept of something called a vanity metric or an actionable metric. And a vanity metric is anything that looks good, is measurable, but it doesn't help you make a decision. So an example could be something like a Facebook like, or a page view, or, sorry, Paul, event attendees. However, that's the giant caveat. An actionable metric and a vanity metric can be the exact same thing depending on your context. So in the case of a conference website, event attendees is actually very actionable. So again, the difference is really just that an actionable metric is tied to specific repeatable tasks, and it helps you decide whether you're succeeding or not. So giant caveat here that basically anything can be either a good or a bad metric in the context of what you're doing. All right, so then you get to the learn part, right? This seems like it should be the easy part. How many of you are familiar with the TV show Friends? I'm not sure if it has a wide popularity here. Oh yeah, okay, so this will look familiar. So basically, you get to the end of the experiment, and either you decide to pivot, stuff is not going well, or you say, shut up, we're going in the right direction, and you persevere. Right, okay, so that all sounds great. You build something small, you figure out if it's working or not, and then you decide what to do. All that is awesome. However, the way that most people implement this is that they start right here with the build, and they miss all that other part of the scientific, excuse me, of the scientific method that is supposed to be part of the lean startup cycle. And essentially what ends up happening is that instead of building all the things, you just build a thing. And it's really just a teeny tiny waterfall, right? It's not actually using the Agile process. It's not actually lean startup. You basically just end up doing a really small slice of Agile, which kind of defeats the purpose of implementing lean startup. So the real reason I'm here, what should we do? What should the team do? Not just the UX people, not just the business people, not just the product people. What should we all do? And the first one is to start with the problem. And based on GOOB, which is just stands for get out of the building. So again, to Jamie's point, go talk to some people. Go to a coffee shop. Not just any people, but interview the people that you think you want to target. Do some validation. Find out what their problems really are. You can do something called a diary study or an experience sample, which I don't have time to talk about in detail today, but basically you have people, you kind of learn about what people's real processes and day-to-day actions look like by asking them the same questions over time. You could do something called an experience map, which is basically just taking the information you gathered from the interviews and the diary sampling and kind of map out the whole experience, kind of see what's going on in the whole scope of someone's life. So as promised to Paul, cat memes are coming. All right, so let's say that you're out in the world and you're observing this, right? The problem is that the cat doesn't have a bed, causing him to look for other places to sleep. But giant caveat. The problem is not we should build a cat bed. That's a solution. We're not there yet. Also, our problem is not that the cat is too big for the box. That's a constraint. You can't shrink the cat unless you have some technology that I don't know about. Maybe somebody in Silicon Valley is working on it, but not yet. Right? Okay, so the first thing you do is really understand the problem of what's going on in real context. Then, make a clear hypothesis. So, I'm not sure what grade it is in Europe, but in America, it's about in the 5th grade that you learn the scientific sort of hypothesis framework. It looks the same in business, right? It's if we do something, build something, provide X value, then these people, those are your targeted personas that you validated, will do something desirable that we want them to do, and we'll know that when some sort of actionable metric, right? So that's how you know that the metric is actionable. It actually answers the question. That doesn't always happen. All right, so again, let's look at some cats. So if we build a comfy nap place, Sammy, that's my cat, won't sleep on my keyboard. And we'll know this to be true when I'm able to do 2 hours of uninterrupted work 5 days in a row, right? That's really specific, it's really clear, and it's really targeted. Then you design your experiment. And Jamie mentioned a few of these earlier. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can design experiments. I'm going to walk through just a couple of high-level ones. One is an A/B test. This is really easy. You can have 2 different versions of something, and if your hypothesis is that one will perform better than another, then you can kind of measure that. Another is Wizard of Oz. So Wizard of Oz really means that it looks like it works on the front end, but it's not scalable, it's not built out on the back end. So Zappos in the States is a good example of this. I know it's maybe a little hard to believe now, but circa about 2000, when they started this, no one bought anything online that they wore, right? Like now I order basically everything I wear online, but they weren't really sure if people were gonna be willing to buy shoes online. So they put up this site to see if people would be willing to do it, and then they went to the store around the corner every time they got an order and bought the shoes themselves in the size and color, right? So on the front end, it looked like it was real, like the Wizard of Oz. But on the back end, they were just running to the warehouse or running to the Macy's around the corner or whatever shoe store around the corner to go buy something. So it doesn't always look like this. There are lots of different variations of Wizard of Oz, but essentially it's that it looks real on the front end, not scalable or really fully built out on the back end. You could do something called an ad test. So if you're not familiar, this is a book by Tim Ferriss called The 4-Hour Workweek. It is exceptionally popular. He went through like 20 or 30 different names. He ran a bunch of ads to see which one should win to be the real thing. I think he did something like 30 versions of it. He ran test after test after test, narrowing it down, narrowing it down, narrowing it down, until he finally picked this one. And I'm not sure that we can contribute his success to the ads, but sure didn't hurt. All right, then after all of that setup work, now you generate your solutions. AKA, you figure out what your MVP is. And the key here is that you do it together as a cross-functional team. So this doesn't mean that the UX team goes off in another room and brainstorms and there's a bunch of sticky notes and markers everywhere, and then they come back and say, ta-da, this is our MVP. Nor does it mean that a developer goes to their computer and writes some stuff by themselves and comes back and says, ta-da, I built a backend. This is our MVP because it's launchable. It means the whole team works together to figure out what should be the smallest chunk of stuff that you can build so that you can move forward. So a couple of methods that I like to use to kind of get everyone together are participatory design workshops, wherein you can include all sorts of different members, excuse me, all sorts of different members of your team, but also actual users, or at least representative users. There are tons of different games and workshops and sort of activities you can use. My favorite is called a 6-up, 1-up, where everybody on the team gets a sheet of paper that looks something like this, and you get a couple of minutes to sketch 6 ideas that solve the problem that you're trying to address. And everybody takes, you usually do it about 6 minutes. Everybody gets a couple of minutes. And you could just be sketching one individual element. You could be sketching out high level. It could be anything. But basically, you take 6 minutes to kind of come up with some ideas. And then you choose your best one, and you write up some notes, and then everybody shares it with each other. And this forces everyone from all different sorts of roles and areas of expertise to all be brainstorming together and working together. So again, back to our problem of the cat mapping. Maybe you had some brainstorming and you came up with a bunch of different ideas. Maybe you could buy a box. Maybe you need a basket. Maybe this fancy cat bed. Maybe an even fancier hamburger cat bed. Who knows? All right, but the point is that you've done all of this thinking, all of this experimentation and brainstorming, then you run your test, right? So the whole point is that you kind of get all the way through all of this upfront thinking part before you do any of the building or experimentation. So really kind of the crucial piece of this is that you start with think, not with build. So here's sort of that loop again. There's build, code something, and this is directly from the Lean Startup website, by the way. You measure, you have data, you learn something from it, and you get new ideas. But what I'm saying is instead of starting with that build piece, you actually start here with ideas. And ideas can come from observation, ideas come from brainstorming, ideas can come from all over the place, but they shouldn't come from what you build. You should start with this piece. So another way to think about that is this is another kind of formulation of the build, measure, learn cycle, which is called think, make, check from the Lean UX kind of thinking. It's the same basic steps, just shifted a bit differently so you can think of the paradigm differently. But really the key is that instead of reducing the whole time it takes to build something, like make a smaller thing, make it shorter, you want to reduce the cycle time all the way through. So instead of building smaller things, you want to learn and get this whole process working faster all the way through. And here's a pro tip to do that. The more precise and smaller your hypothesis, the less you have to build, and the easier it is to come to a conclusion if you have a hypothesis. So if your hypothesis is like, I think a red button will perform better than a blue button, that's a super easy thing to tell if you did correctly. Whereas if your hypothesis is, I think red is a color that some people like. That's such a huge assumption, such a big thing, that it's really hard to test. But if you can really narrow down your hypothesis, the faster you'll be able to go through the whole cycle. And lastly, I just kind of want to leave you with, don't forget about the big picture. So a lot of times I've seen companies that are working on Lean Startup, even if they get really good at running experiments, really quick at kind of going through the cycle, they forget to look at the big picture. Because the thing about an experience is that it's not just about what color the button is or what this interface looks like. It's about the whole experience. It's about the first interaction I have when I sign up for something, every interaction I have every time I log in, or maybe don't have to log in, as the case may be, every time I reach for my wallet or don't have to. So you want to make sure that not only are you looking at the tiny little individual experiments of Lean Startup, but you look at the whole big picture of the experience as a whole. Okay, and again, I will not attempt to speak Polish, but thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and I'll be around for the next couple days, so come find me if you've got questions. Thank you.